Video I've wanted to do for a while is something entitled "The Alt-Right is Pornographic," and one of the people I feel best illustrates this is probably Luke Ford. And when I first heard about him, I had to question how could this guy who was a pioneer in journalism of the porn industry, who had actually directed a porn film himself, deeply involved with it, how could he make the switch from having that as his career, just completely taking over his life? How could he switch to being basically a journalist for the alt-right? You know, always wondering what the goss is on Richard Spencer or this person or that person. And at this point, I view it as two very similar jobs. And the reason why I say that is because my understanding of pornography is that pornography basically takes a holistic experience, which is sex, and it distills that experience down to certain elements that are possible to transmit through electronic media. So real sex, you actually have kinetic contact with the person, you have your olfactory senses, you have a kind of a stereo audio, right? It's three-dimensional. You might say, if you wanted to be eccentric about it, you could say maybe there's some kind of electromagnetic sense that we have when we touch other people physically, and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of senses that allow us to distinguish between pornography, which is purely visual and audio, versus the real thing. So porn has basically two elements that it can work with, visual and audio, and it distills those images and that audio, and it also the psychological elements of the plot and what's going on, and submissiveness and domination, masculinity and femininity, and it takes all these elements, or fetishistic elements, and it takes them to the nth degree. It takes them to the extreme. Now the reason is because real sex, because it's real, you have all of your senses together. If you think there are 5 or 6 or 7, however human senses you think there are, and we do have senses of certain, like our balance, the sense of balance is one of our senses. It's I believe, the synovial fluid in the ears. So there are more than 5 senses, the ones that you're taught in elementary school. And however many you think there are, they allow us to distinguish between reality and a video. And by taking these just 2 senses, the visual and the auditory, and just concentrating them and magnifying them and taking them to the extreme, pornography is able to achieve arousal in people who otherwise could only achieve arousal through real-life experiences. So it is a substitute for the real thing, for real sex, by simply distilling certain elements and taking them to the extreme. Now, people, just as people have a desire for sex, people also have a desire for in-group or collectivism. They want to be part of a group. And they also have a desire for normality, for norms, for familiarity, and I would say thirdly, they have a desire for continuity. Now, these 3 things sort of jive together, right? You want to be part of an in-group, you want to be part of a collective. So naturally, the smallest collective, the one that's familiar to most people, is the family. Now, the family's been broken down and destroyed and whatever, but still, there's the conception that, hey, the music that my parents listened to, the culture of my parents, where they came from, these are all things that you optimally would like to jive with, right? You would like that, hey, my parents and I, or my family, my siblings, my grandparents, whatever, however extended you want to go, we all sort of listen to the same music, or we can at least enjoy it together. We go to the same festivities, we have the same holidays, we have the same religion. All of these elements in common allow people to have a sense of in-group, a sense of collective, a sense of continuity, a sense of familiarity, a sense of stability and anchoring in their life, so they're not just this free-floating individual. Now, some people are able to be highly effective in instances where they are a free-floating individual. So these are, your international businessmen, your bankers, your cosmopolitans, your people who are world travelers, your global nomads, homeless people. These are people who feel very at home, having no family, no religion, no psychological continuity, no familiarity. They're adrenaline junkies. They're always looking for the next location, the next new person to meet, the next new thing to see. And so they're very comfortable basically having a lack of comfort. But most people, the majority of people, do desire a sense of family, a sense of in-group, a sense of continuity, a sense of familiarity, and they also like harmony. So, right, so you have a religion, a government, a culture, a people, racial elements, all of these things. Optimally, people feel most comfortable when all of these things jive together. So that would mean that you have a government that doesn't necessarily have a state religion, but, you know, it's a mostly Christian government for the most part. You know, you have freedom of religion, but people are just mostly Christian. And then, you know, it's a 90% white country, so it's not 100% white, but it's a mostly white country. And then you have a culture that's based around, like, baseball. Baseball is the national sport. Everyone kind of likes baseball. Not all people, but most people, they like baseball. You know, there's certain foods that everyone eats. We all kind of enjoy the same foods, and if you want to have a meal with people, you don't have to, like, look up their ethnic background or ask them, are you a vegan, are you a vegetarian, what kind of diet are you on? It's just like everyone sort of eats the same foods. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, medical exceptions, and so on, but most people, they eat the same foods. And if you assume that someone eats a certain kind of food, no one's going to be offended. No one's going to say, oh my God, you eat animals, or oh my God, you eat GMO, like genetically modified foods, right? I'm not saying genetically modified foods are good. I'm just saying that most people like it when there are norms in society. That you can assume someone is a Christian, or in a Muslim society, you can assume someone's a Muslim, or in a Buddhist society, you can assume someone's Buddhist, or in China, you can assume someone is a communist, right? You can assume things about other people, and that allows you to trust them. And that social trust allows you to feel more comfortable. That, hey, I know the person sitting next to me, even if they're a stranger, they have the same religion, same language, the same culture, the same reality we share collective reality, so we have shared interests, naturally, as a consequence of all the shared collectives that we're a part of, religiously, culturally, in terms of our culinary preference. And that allows us to make certain assumptions and work well together, and, you know, to actually apply the golden rule more easily, because if you view someone as being closer to yourself, more like yourself, it's more easy to empathize with them. The easier it is to empathize with them, the more likely you are to do good to them, the more likely they are to do good to you. And this is one of the theories of white privilege, is that white people are helping each other out because subconsciously they look at another white person and they think, hey, you could be my brother, you could be my child, you could be my parent, you could be my grandparent, whatever, you could be my cousin. And so because subconsciously they're thinking in terms of, hey, you could be related to me, they're more likely to favor that person, more likely to empathize with that person. And I think that's a legitimate analysis of reality, that people do indeed most of the time act this way. Now, certain people actually have psychological dysfunctions where they have trouble with facial recognition. There are certain people who actually can't remember the faces of other people, and these people actually have difficulty distinguishing between races of people. You could ask them, is this person black or is this person white? And there are certain cases, rare cases, where people actually say, you know, I actually don't know what race this person is, because they have that structure of their brain, which is responsible for symbology and recognizing and categorizing faces, has totally broken down, so they have a lot of trouble with that. Now, with all of this being said, we have a basic desire for sex, and we experience sex through senses. We have a basic desire for familiarity, continuity, and in-group. And we experience that psychologically and symbolically, for the most part. So what the alt-right has done is it said, okay, well, we can't actually have a national religion. Can't do it, right? It is what it is. Christianity is on the downturn. Islam is going up. Atheism is going up. You know, various New Age cults are going up. Buddhism going up. So all these things are increasing. Christianity is decreasing for the most part. Whiteness. You can't have like a norm of race. You can't have racial norms. You can't say, yeah, we're a mostly white country. You can't do that anymore. These are just things that are outside of the control of a normal person. So you can't have kind of national unity in terms of religion. You can't have it in terms of race. You can't have it in terms of the language that's being spoken, right? More and more people are speaking Spanish. So you could go down the line and look at all these different things where familiarity is breaking down, social trust is breaking down, continuity is breaking down in terms of older generations, what music they like to listen to, new generations, what music they like to listen to. If you look at 100 years ago, go to your great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents if you have to. Go back until your ancestors are farmers. And most people, if you're not an aristocrat, most people can do this where it's like, okay, my ancestors were farmers or fishermen, or they worked some kind of agricultural or culinary job, essentially. They worked with the land or with direct resource acquisition of food. So you go back to this point, and you ask them, you go back in time, you interview them, you say, what kind of music do you like to listen to? What are some of your favorite songs? And they'll probably tell you something like, well, I like these folk songs, and maybe I like these religious or church songs. And you say, well, what kind of music do your parents like to listen to? And they say, yeah, they like pretty much the same kind of songs. Maybe they have a different favorite song, but it's all within the same genre, within the same ethnic tradition, the same religious tradition. You could keep going back several generations, and you find a point where you don't have to go back far to find ancestors where it's like their musical taste was not radically different from their parents and their parents from before them, and you start to look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, these songs and these rhythms and these beats and this genre of music is hundreds of years old and doesn't really change much over time. There's a huge degree of familiarity and continuity and stability between the changes in the music. Same thing with culinary taste, the same thing with dress and fashion. All of these elements, they did change over time due to random mutation, but there was a huge degree of stability that was existent that is now passing away. And so the music that you appreciate is probably radically different, and there's this intergenerational loss. So it's not just black people versus white people, but it's the millennial versus the boomer, right? So there's no continuity in society. There's nothing that unites all of us. And that's disturbing to a huge number of people. Like I said, some people can just look at it and say, so what? How can I make a buck? Or, how can I help poor people? Or, there are all kinds of people who say, okay, whatever. I don't share the same music as my grandparents, so what? And they don't really care, and they move on with their lives. But I think for a lot of people, at least on a subconscious level, all of this is very distressing to a vast majority of people. And I think most Trump voters would say, yeah, this stuff is very distressing. Maybe not consciously, but unconsciously, I think, yeah, they would have a not quite a disgust reaction, perhaps, but just a sense of unease, of just unfamiliarity. Unheimlichkeit is the German word. And so basically what the alt-right does is it rolls in, and in the same way the pornographer takes advantage of your sex drive and your desire for sex and says, hey, I'll fulfill that, I'll satisfy that, here's a porn video. And you look at it and it's so extreme and it's so over the top, and all of the elements, the shapes of the body, everyone's super athletic, super fit, or the proportions are super, accentuated, and the plot line is super lustful. Like everything that the real life is just exaggerated to the point where even though it's just the visual, just the auditory, it can still be arousing. And what the alt-right does is it takes your desire for familiarity and conformity and in-group and collectivism and continuity and harmony between the different spheres of society, the religious, the cultural, the ethnic, culinary, musical, whatever. It takes all of that and it brings it to the extreme. And it says, it says here's the Faustian bargain in a way. I don't know if that's the right term for this particular thing, but bear with me. It's like the devil comes to you, that comes to a beta male who can't get laid. To the kid who's, maybe he's not ugly, but maybe he's just socially awkward, or he's anxious, or whatever. He's not confident. And he says, look, you can't get girls, you can't get women to sleep with you. I will give you porn, and that will satisfy your sex drive, and then you can be happy again. And the guy says, sure, okay, porn, yeah, that's great, I can use that, and that can satisfy my desires, and now I'm happy. Or so the person thinks. But in reality, it's destructive, and it's not healthy, and so on and so forth. That's not what this video is about. But you look at what the alt-right has done, and the alt-right has said, hey, look, You're kind of like the beta male who can't get laid. You are a person who desires in-group and normalcy and collectivism and continuity and familiarity. You desire all these things. You want a world in which the government and the religion and the culinary taste and the musical taste and everything is kind of integrated in a way that makes everything harmonious and work together and not be in conflict all the time. And you want a beautiful world. You want to get rid of ugliness, and you just want something harmonious and beautiful. It takes people like this, and it says, hey, you can't actually, in the same way that it says to the beta male, you can't actually get laid, it says, hey, you can't actually have these things. You can't have continuity in your life. You can't live in an ethnically homogeneous country. You know, you can't achieve these goals. You can't stop the browning of America. This is just what it is. And so, therefore, here's alt-right websites, here's alt-right memes and podcasts and content that you can watch and listen to. And it's so extreme. It says, no, we don't want a 90% white country, we want a 100% white country. And we're just all about all of these just, you know, very violent stuff. We're just into all this very extreme, just socially alienating stuff. And this, of course, has been done before, right? So the grunge people, the goth people, like, what were the goths? The goths were a bunch of white kids in the 90s who felt alienated from society. So they said, hey, if you're not going to integrate us into your society, we're going to reject you. And that is a coping mechanism, right? When someone rejects you or society rejects you, one way to cope with that rejection, because it does hurt and it continues to hurt, one way is to say, hey, I didn't like you anyway because I'm a goth, I dress in all black. Look how I despise you and look how I have this contempt for you. And that's actually a way of lying to yourself and convincing yourself that you don't want to be part of society. Of course, they actually do, and that's why they're trying so hard to differentiate themselves and say, hey, look, I'm so unique and I'm so different, I don't want to be a part of your society anyway. That's a big lie that they tell themselves to feel better. And the alt-right is doing the same thing when they post these edgy memes. They say, oh, I didn't want to be part of your society anyway, I just want to, you know, live in this idealized, you know, totally eugenicist state where, you know, we do terrible things and violent and cruel, just like overly sadistic things to people because they're weak or because they were ugly or because they didn't fit in. It takes it to the nth degree, and at that point, you're taking basic, normal desires in the same way that sex desire is normal and pretty universal among most young men. You're taking something that's normal, the desire for conformity and familiarity and continuity, you're taking all that stuff and you're taking it to the nth degree. And just like pornography, it is an outlet for those feelings. It's an outlet for that desire. It's a way to satisfy those desires without actually you're not accomplishing anything except masturbation. In both cases, porn and the alt-right. With porn, you know, you see the beautiful women and you jack off and then it's done. You haven't accomplished anything. It's not like you actually got laid. It's not actually like you got a girlfriend or you got a wife or you had kids or you did anything that the sex desire is meant to drive you toward. You just kind of jacked off in your basement. Nobody knew about it. It's your own little secret. And you move on with your life being a beta male loser who can't get laid. Now with the alt-right, it's very similar, right? So you're not actually changing the demographics of the country. You're not actually changing the religious landscape or the linguistic landscape or the cultural landscape. You're not actually impacting change. You're just going on, you're reading your memes, and you're kind of chuckling to yourself in your basement. Now, the difference, I guess, here is that people can make the argument that, hey, whoa, that's not actually what's going on here. In both cases, actually, pornography is now this communal thing. Pornography is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry where you have all these subreddits, you have all these communities, the fetish communities, whatever. People are getting together and saying, hey, you watch porn? I watch porn too. You like this fetish? I do too. And that's kind of the genesis, in a way, of the LGBTQP community, right? That whole community arose because a bunch of guys who were in the closet started saying, hey, you like this paraphilia? I like it too. Let's get together, form a community. And so that's something that's actually powerful, and it has affected change, and it continues to affect change. And the alt-right would say, hey, we're doing the same thing. We all have this desire for all these things. Yes, we're taking it to an extreme degree, but by recognizing one another, by communalizing, we're going to be able to join forces, and we're going to be able to impact the real discourse. We're going to be able to move the Overton window and give space for the moderate rightists to come in and to enforce normalcy and harmony and continuity between these different groups in society. And that would work, except in the case of the porn community, the Catholic Church and government and anti-sodomy laws, they were kind of keeping the LGBTQ community down for a while. And then after the 60s, all of that kind of dissolved. And since then, the government has sanctioned a lot of it. So rather than censoring those communities, ever since the reinterpretation of the First Amendment as guaranteeing your right to obscenity rather than your right to, voicing an abstract political thesis or religious thesis, it now is all about your erotic freedom. So ever since then, the government has sanctioned it and it's promoted it. So in the case of these, pornographic communities, they have been buoyed up by structural forces, throughout government and religious life and whatever. Whereas you look at the alt-right and they're being clamped down upon and they're being pushed in a direction that I think is certainly less productive. If you're a gay man and you're living in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the gay community and the underground gay club scene and the pornographic scene and how that's impacting the transgender community today and all of that, you can see that as helpful to your cause. But stepping back and looking at how the alt-right is interacting with reality, you can see, okay, these are young men who could be integrating successfully with society relative to their peers, and instead they're alienating themselves from their peers, right? They could be gaining positions of power within their community, and instead they're alienating themselves. And I see it very similar to the goth movement of, these are a bunch of young men who feel rejected from society, and so they're like, hey, you reject me? Well, I'll reject you. I'm going to become alt-right, I'm going to be edgy, and I'm going to use all these obscenities, and I'm going to offend people, and I'm going to just say things just to, reinforce, oh, you're going to reject me from society? Well, I don't care. I don't care. I didn't want you anyway. I didn't want your multicultural society because it's trash, it's worthless. But the truth is, and this is kind of the unfortunate truth that people don't want to hear because it's not a good coping mechanism. It actually means you have to work and do something. The truth is that change is affected by small, effective minorities of people. It's not really affected by a bunch of disaffected people going off and watching porn. The reason why the LGBTQ community, the queer community, the porn community, the reason why it's grown and become more powerful is because it's supported from the top down by elites in the government, in the churches, in education system, whatever, in the media, in Hollywood. So because it's been supported from the top down, it's been allowed to rise up and be promoted and achieve success. Without elite patrons, mass movements don't succeed. That's the truth for the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Civil War, any conflict, the American Revolution. There's no such thing as a peasant revolt or a mass revolution. Anytime it appears that the masses are rising up, really they've simply been instigated by some dissident elite. And I covered this a little bit in my video on the Hakka Manchu War, otherwise known as the Chinese Civil War, otherwise known as, the big Chinese War of the 19th century, where you had the Heavenly Kingdom, and these were Hakka people. These were disaffected elites, and they did organize this mass revolution, but masses themselves are not really potent or powerful because they're not organized. You need an elite to organize them. So if the alt-right was smart, they would say, hey, let's stop providing jack-off material for these young disaffected men. Let's start breeding our own elite to get in positions of power so that we can control masses of people and we can affect change. And that would mean figuring out ways to integrate into society and giving advice to people like, hey, instead of just being angry and offensive all the time, why don't we talk about, how do you get involved with your community? How do you socialize with people? How do you do these things that used to come naturally to people but now are a bit difficult? For a number of reasons. Because I think a lot of people aren't just natural extroverts. And I think a lot of people, they need some kind of superstructure, cultural structure of society telling them How do you act? What are your table manners? What kind of fashion do you wear? Like, all of these things that used to be a given, that were universal, that everyone was expected to conform to these standards, now it's just a free-for-all where you have to decide for yourself and make it up for yourself. And a lot of people are floundering, and they're very confused. So telling these people, hey, this is how to dress, this is what to eat, this is your diet, this is, this is your friend group. And so the only people I see doing something like this, like a fraternal organization, would be something like the Proud Boys. But even then, I think that, that's not an elite, right? Those are a bunch of, like, middle class or lower middle class people, working class people who get together and they drink and they talk. And that's their social group, and maybe that works for them and makes them feel better and improves their lives, but it's not going to breed an elite. So you have to take smart people and you have to say, how do you get in a position of power in your life? And that could mean becoming a dentist, or it could mean going into politics, or it could mean becoming a community leader, could mean getting into real estate. I mean, there are a number of fields that can help establish power for yourself so that you can influence your community and be part of an elite. But that's not really being talked about so much. A lot of what's being talked about is all this very specific political analysis on the one hand, and then all of these, like, again, the just wildly fantastical visions of the future. And I hope that people are becoming more realistic. I hope people are stepping back and saying, okay, maybe the gothic teenage rebellion angsty phase is something that we need to get over, and we need to get serious about, becoming, if we don't like the elite of our country, then we need to become a new elite. And that doesn't happen just by having emotional outbursts and pathos all the time, but it means having some logos, structuring your life, having an ethos, rules to your life of how you're going to structure your life. What church community should you be in? What things should you study? What kind of career should you be in? How should we socialize? How should we be interacting with one another? What norms should we have? What clothes should we wear? And I'm repeating myself now, but these are very practical concerns that people should be focused on. And you should be able to meet up with people and have a community. If this is this online movement, it should be something that is transferable to the real life without, like, destroying your life. Because for 2016 and much of 2017, that's what it was about. It's like you have this online band of brothers, and then they brought it into the real life, and people started committing suicide because they lost their jobs, they lost their families, they lost everything. So that is not a sustainable model, right? Now, if people were starving in the streets, I would say, okay, maybe you do need to have people who are fanatical, who are willing to go that far and be crazy and risk everything and sacrifice everything. But we're not in a collapse. We're not, basically, the collapse stage happens when people are starving in the streets. People are not starving in the streets. Okay, so if people are not starving in the streets, you need something stable. And that means your ideology and your offensiveness need to be tailored to something within some kind of Overton window, to the point where, you can approach normal people and they don't look at you like you're some kind of sociopath and some kind of sadist who just wants to hurt weak and vulnerable people simply to satisfy your own low self-esteem or whatever. Right? You need to have some level of reasonability and just talk honestly with people and say, look, we have a sex drive, and as logical, reasonable people, we should be able to talk about that, and how do we satisfy our sex drive, and what are healthy ways and what are unhealthy ways to do that. Like, we could compare the different ways that people do that and say, well, what are the externalities, what are the consequences of risky sexual behavior? Well, you could get an STD. There's emotional consequences, psychological consequences, and perhaps spiritual consequences. We should talk about that. And when we talk about the need for an in-group, the need for collectivism, the need for norms, the needs for familiarity, all of those needs that people have are not being met. Now, they can be met with pornography, right? They can be met with neo-Nazism and edgy memes and insults and offensiveness for the sake of being offensive. That's not sustainable. That's just a gothic teen angsty rebellion. That's not an elite strategy. That's something that elites use to manipulate masses. But who are the alt-right elites? There are none, right, for the most part. And so what do you do? Well, you have to come to people plainly and say, look, these are basic desires. People want to be part of an in-group. People want familiarity. People want continuity and harmony and beauty. And we have to figure out ways of sustainably satisfying that. And there has to be a path toward a more sustainable society, because right now we are splitting apart in a way that, even if it's not extremely violent right now, even if people aren't starving in the streets, even if there aren't like huge gun battles in the streets over politics, I think it's doing psychic damage to people. I think it's stressing people out. I think it's causing anxiety. I think suicide rates for middle-aged white men are rising, and so that's an indicator that something here is terribly wrong, and we need to change course to fix that problem. That we live in a society where people are more peaceful and pacified than perhaps any other period in history. But psychically, spiritually, probably that's not a good trade. It's not a good trade to castrate the white men of your society in exchange for having just a very pacified, docile society. Because I think even if our lifespans are longer, there's the adage about the lion and the lamb. Would you rather live a day as a lion or 100 years as a lamb? It's the question of quality of life versus quantity of life. And I think at the end of the day, if you explain it to people rationally, a lot of them would say, hey, I would rather have a high-quality life than a long, depressed life. And you have to ask, why is everyone depressed? Why is everyone anxious? Well, if someone's not, fulfilling their sexual desires, that could cause a lot of psychological problems. If someone's not fulfilling their desire for continuity, familiarity, in-group, then they could also have a lot of psychological problems. And those are worth taking serious economic, cultural, public policy steps to adjust the way that society is run, adjust the way a direction is going in, to alleviate some of the severe psychological harm, the spiritual harm that's coming to people. We can do something to fix it. And we can make gradual steps. It doesn't need to be an all-or-nothing situation where it's like the ethno-state or death. I think that's ridiculous. It turns people off. And personally, if you go out there and you advocate for something like that, you are risking your livelihood and your well-being. And that's not really beneficial to you. And it's not really beneficial to anything you're actually trying to achieve. And it's not going to make a better society for you if you start, wearing uniforms and marching in the streets. That's not actually going to make society better. So if you do want to live in a better society, you do have to do what every elite has ever done, and that is you need to have some forbearance, and you need to have some long-term thinking, and you need to start carrying yourself and acting in a way of like, how do I attain power in this society? And how do I do it in a way that I'm not destroying my own personal assets, and I'm not, polarization. People talk about polarization. And again, look at where ISIS has gone. ISIS has failed in many respects. And ISIS as a strategy for the Islamization of Europe, I think, has failed in many respects. I think when I talk to people and they oppose Islam, the number one reason that people oppose Islam, just regular people, is they think bombs, terrorist attacks, things blowing up, people in cars driving into crowds. They don't oppose Islam because, well, the metaphysics of Islam are deeply flawed. Or they don't say, well, the cultural impact of Islam, or, the dysgenic effect of populations which are majority Muslim. Like, they don't go into any actual substantive reasons. We all know that Islamic terrorist attacks number maybe a few thousand dead every year. Meanwhile, automobile accidents are in the tens of thousands of people dead. So, in all honesty, I hear these things, and it is, at some point, you have to think, this is stupid, right? It is stupid to care about terrorist attacks, except to the extent that it is symbolic of a cultural context, or of a genetic conquest, or some kind of larger conquest, the replacement of a civilization, the replacement of a demographic and a population. that's more substantial and long-lasting, right? But the fact that, okay, so a couple thousand people died, yes, we are sad in the abstract, but as people regulated by Dunbar's number, we can't really empathize viscerally with this abstract thing unless you have some personal connection to it, which most people don't. And, again, in the abstract, sure, it's sad. And I would say that it's sad that people die in automobile accidents, but it's not sociopathic to say that you don't directly feel empathy for those people in the same way that you feel empathy for, members of your family, someone that you're close to. Statistics are not really emotionally impactful. So, I don't think the whole polarization thing is actually all it's chalked up to be. And I think it does produce a lot of mental masturbation and people wasting their lives and their livelihoods on things that aren't really effective. And I think there's so much more that could be done if people redirected themselves from, like, angsty teenage memes to, like, hey, how do we actually gain power? How does that happen? And focusing on that. How do we improve our lives? How do we become better people? Part of that requires honesty with ourselves, and part of it requires understanding that honesty with others can be selfish. Right? Just being brutally honest with other people. Like, you see an ugly person on the street, and you just shout, hey, you're ugly. Or you say to another person, oh, that person over there, that's an ugly person. Now, I guess subjectively it is true that you observe the person and you have a judgment within your mind and you judge them to be ugly. And so I guess it cannot be falsified if you really look at a person, you think they're ugly. But to express that and to say, well, I'm just brutally honest, that's selfish on your part. Your lack of filter. It's selfish to just say whatever you think whenever you want to. And it is a kind of power play. To be able to do that shows your power, so you're demonstrating power. But if you don't have real power, if you're just an anonymous person on the internet and you're saying, look at that ugly person, and you receive no social backlash for it, you can feel powerful because and again, it's the same thing as pornography. You're simulating the feeling of being a powerful man, because a powerful man really can go and say, that person is ugly. And they won't suffer repercussions because they're the alpha of the tribe. But if a weak person on the internet says, hey, that person's ugly, they're simply simulating the feeling of what it is to be like an alpha. So don't do that, because it is masturbation. It's not going to improve your life. You're simply satisfying your urges without actually doing productive things that your urges are meant to point you towards. Sex drive is meant to point you towards relationships with people and families. Your desire for conformity and familiarity and in-group and whatever, that's designed to point you toward, evolutionary strategies that are embodied in chimpanzees and whatnot. It's a strategy meant to promote your genetic infrastructure and ultimately the moral encoding that's in your DNA. The encoding that tells you whether or not to be violent, whether or not to be temperate, whether or not to be logical, reasonable, rational. Like, there is a moral encoding in your DNA, and all of these strategies of collectivism, familiarity, continuity are meant to promote your genetic structure over the moral genetic structure of other people. So, I think that's all I have to say for today. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.